What's wrong with this picture? What about this one and this one? Look closely. Maybe the horizon is crooked, or the subject is off center, or the figure is cut off. Your gut might tell you something's wrong, that this image breaks the rules of good composition. But what if it isn't wrong at all? What if what you see as wrong is exactly what makes this picture unforgettable? Every image exists inside a frame. The rectangle of a viewfinder, the borders of a canvas, the edges of a screen, all define what is inside and what is left out. Composition is born in this boundary. It is a decision about what to include, what to exclude, and how the elements inside that frame relate to one another. It shapes meaning just as much as color, subject, or light. Photographs, in particular, are created within a spatial context, and that context is the viewfinder frame. Before pressing the shutter, the photographer decides where to stop looking and where to crop. Within that rectangle, every line and shape has weight, but so does what's missing. A painter, on the other hand, works with a fixed plane, negotiating the composition within the dimensions of the surface itself. In film, the frame doesn't just contain, it moves, shifts, expands, and contracts. Even when the camera is still, what's placed at the center is always a deliberate choice. In comics and video games, composition reaches new levels of complexity altogether. Now there is interactivity to consider, or in the case of comics, paneling and pacing. Now the eye moves not just within a frame, but across pages, or through spaces in real time. Everyone knows those diagrams, the ones of a rectangle divided by 2 vertical lines and 2 horizontal lines that create a 3x3 grid. This is the rule of thirds, a foundational guide in classical composition. Its premise is simple. By placing key elements of an image along these lines, or at their intersections, the composition becomes more dynamic. The eye is naturally drawn to these focal points, creating a sense of balance without symmetry, movement without chaos. But this grid is only one amongst many. Classical painters used similar composition strategies long before photography even existed. Symbolic hierarchies such as the golden ratio or divine proportion underpin Renaissance paintings and continue to influence modern design. Baroque painters explore diagonal lines and triangular compositions to lead the eye with dramatic force. The grid gives all artists a structure to which they can anchor their visual intuition. It offers a quiet geometry, an invisible scaffolding upon which emotion, tension, and movement can be built. Within its measured divisions, complexity can be composed, and meaning can emerge with clarity. Because a good image without composition is an accident. And although such accidents do exist, it is the duty of the artist to be intentional. It is through composition that the artist moves beyond documentation and into interpretation. To compose an image is to create an everlasting metaphor. Image making, in its purest form, is visual storytelling, and the best images can convey meaning through something as simple as the arrangement of their visual elements. In the Ultimate Guide series, I explored the key elements that give an image its narrative power. We begin with composition, the structure that guides the eye and shapes meaning. Future entries will bring elements like color into focus, enriching our understanding of visual storytelling. We live in a three-dimensional world, full of movement and change. A frame, by contrast, captures a single static moment on a flat surface. To make an image feel real and speak to viewers, it needs a sense of structure that suggests depth beyond its constraints. This is where composition comes in. Like grammar in writing, compositional rules give images clarity and form. They help organize space in a way that communicates ideas powerfully. Learning composition is like learning music. You practice the basics until they become instinct. The same goes for visual structure. With enough practice, compositional tools become second nature, forming the invisible foundation behind strong, expressive images. When we think of a great image, let's say a great photograph, we often think of someone like Henri Cartier-Bresson, a photographer who produced a body of work so rigorous, so attuned to the possibilities of the frame, that his images seem inevitable. Not because they are perfect in the traditional sense, but because they are precise, composed with such clarity of vision that nothing feels arbitrary. These are images where every inch of space contributes to a unified experience. For Cartier-Bresson, this unity often came in what he called l'instant décisif, or the decisive moment. His photos were built on the tension between spontaneity and structure, but his genius wasn't just in seeing something worth capturing, but in seeing how that something aligned with the edge of the frame, with the rules of composition. Much like the Impressionists before him, Cartier-Bresson was interested in the spontaneity of life, the everyday moments that come and go. But to produce images of this caliber, he could never rely on luck or instinct alone. If anything, it meant he had to be always prepared. He knew he needed to become a photographer so attuned to geometry, to rhythm, to life unfolding, that when the moment came, he would be ready. His philosophy of composition also meant he never cropped his photos. Cropping means removing or cutting out parts of an image after it has been captured, usually to improve the composition, eliminate distractions, or change the framing. It's done during the editing process, not while taking the photo. When Cartier-Bresson refused to crop his photos, it was a statement about discipline and intent. For him, the composition had to be found in the moment, in camera, and preserved as a whole. His compact Leica 35mm rangefinder camera was a perfect weapon, discreet and fast. It allowed him to shoot quickly, quietly, without disrupting the flow of life. Cartier-Bresson would often wait patiently at a location, observing how people moved through the space, anticipating that 1 second worth capturing. That meant he trained himself to see through the viewfinder as if it were the final print. And this commitment to composition at the point of capture is what gives his images such cohesion. Nothing feels corrected or forced. It feels seen. Training the eye to see composition is a practice in attention, an act of learning to recognize structure where there often is none. Over time, the grid becomes less a tool imposed on the world and more a way of seeing within it. This awareness doesn't restrict creativity, it refines it. With enough practice, the grid no longer needs to be visualized. It becomes embedded in the way one sees frame and ultimately creates. At its core, composition is the skill of knowing what to show, what not to show, and how to show it, all in favor of enhancing the meaning of the story being told. For painters like Cézanne, a good composition doesn't merely imitate life, but interprets nature through carefully constructed visual relations. It captures the underlying order of the world through planes, shapes, lines, and rhythm. This idea of composition as structure can also be seen in the works of Stanley Kubrick. Kubrick approached composition with a meticulous and deliberate eye, using visual structure to evoke psychological tension. His frames are often geometrically precise, employing symmetry, one-point perspective, and leading lines to draw the viewer's gaze towards a focal point. This creates a sense of order that paradoxically heightens unease, especially when that order is disrupted or filled with narrative ambiguity. Different from Henri Cartier-Bresson, Kubrick's images were not captured, they were designed. Never an element left to chance, never an element out of place. Take, for example, his use of one-point perspective, a compositional technique where all lines converge towards a single vanishing point. Kubrick returns to this again and again, not just for aesthetic impact, but to suggest psychological pressure. Nothing is accidental. Every prop, every figure, every corridor is arranged with precision. Composition becomes more than a visual tool, it becomes narrative. The symmetry can suggest balance or unnatural perfection. That tension is Kubrick's genius, using structure to unsettle.
You know, of course, though, he's right about the 9000 series having a perfect operational record.
One of his most powerful tools is the wide-angle lens, which exaggerates spatial depth and makes environments feel vast, even overwhelming. The wide lens swallows characters in architectural symmetry, amplifying a sense of scale that can overwhelm or isolate. There's also a rhythmic quality to this approach, reinforcing symmetry and creating visual beats. When the human figure is placed at the heart of this geometry, they are visually dwarfed by the precision around it. This technique isn't about realism, it's about control. Every element in the frame becomes part of the compositional logic. One of the simplest and most powerful techniques in your arsenal is framing. Framing isn't just about what's inside the edges of an image. It's about using elements within the scene to create boundaries around your subject.
I mean, send it over. I'll shoot it right over to you then. Okay, real good then.
The mangaka Tsutomu Nihei constructs his images with an almost reverential attention to space and framing. His compositions are not simply frames within a narrative, they are environments that define the narrative. Trained as an architect, his visual world is built from brutalist form, vanishing points that stretch into infinity, and towering structures that seem to exist outside of time. Scale becomes a narrative device. Characters are often reduced to tiny silhouettes within monolithic settings, emphasizing not only their vulnerability, but their insignificance within the systems and structures around them. Rather than rely on action or dialogue, Nihei lets spaces do the storytelling. The emptiness between forms, the tensions of negative space, and the distortion of perspective all work together to generate contemplation. His panels breathe with stillness, but that stillness is never accidental. It's precisely composed through deliberate visual structure. For Nihei, composition isn't just a means of organizing a scene, it is the very architecture of meaning of the scene. If we want to learn to compose images with a sense of depth, we must pay attention to framing. Framing introduces layers into an image: foreground, middle ground, background. In moving images, this becomes even more powerful. The camera can push through a frame or reveal layers as the scene unfolds, adding dimensional rhythm to the composition. Paul Strand is a photographer whose work possesses a kind of architectural serenity. When we look at his photographs, it is clear that Strand wasn't interested in flair or spectacle. His images are stripped down and distilled. They are about the intrinsic power of form, tone, and proportion. His philosophy of composition asserts that great images are built within a fundamental syntax. He was extremely aware of painting traditions, particularly the formal concerns of early 20th century art movements like Cubism, but he sought to deliberately carve out a photographic language that was independent from them. As he wrote, photography should not aspire to be painting, it should aspire to be itself. He believed one of the most powerful compositional instincts was to learn where to stop looking, and so his compositional style was defined by this search for clarity. He approached composition not as an afterthought or embellishment, but as the foundation of meaning in his images. This compositional restraint gives his images a sense of visual rightness, grounded in structure. Geometry plays a quiet but powerful role in composition. When three or more similar objects align, they form a virtual line. They establish flow, hierarchy, and structure. Learning to see and use these invisible connections strengthens the composition's internal logic and rhythm. While straight lines suggest order and direction, curved lines feel organic and inviting. They gently lead the eye through the frame. Leading lines, whether straight or curved, are compositional pathways. They direct attention to a focal point, give depth to an image, and create a sense of visual journey. Photographer Alexander Rodchenko, whose revolutionary work in 1920s Soviet Russia utilized the frame as pure geometry to visualize and reorder the world. In his photographs, Rodchenko turned the camera on its head, literally. His radical upwards and downwards angles shattered the static eye-level tradition. He understood that deciding the placement of subjects within the frame isn't merely a technical decision, it is an expressive one. These dynamic viewpoints weren't just stylistic flourishes, they disrupted passive viewing and demanded engagement. His compositions often emphasized diagonals, sharp contrasts, and asymmetrical balance, turning architecture and even people into abstract forms. This approach was rooted in the principles of constructivism, photography as a tool not for reproduction, but for construction. He used perspective to flatten space or to elongate it dramatically, compressing background and foreground into rhythmic patterns. In doing so, Rodchenko showed that where and how you place a subject within the frame whether in the corner, at the edge, or leaning into a vanishing point. All of that is a form of visual argument. It's not just about capturing a scene, it's about reordering perception. In painting, these types of compositional decisions are even more deliberate, as painters possess a unique kind of compositional freedom. Unlike photographers or filmmakers who often respond to the real world through a lens, the painter begins with nothing but a surface and imagination. Yet, even in this freedom, structure persists. Many painters use compositional grids, not as constraints, but as frameworks for invention. The grid may be invisible to the viewer, but is silently guiding the placement of forms, the rhythm of space, the balance between the figures and the scene. Leonardo da Vinci sketched with the golden ratio in mind. Even in surreal or expressionist work, such as that of Francis Bacon, figures are often enclosed in ghostly scaffolds, cages of perspective that hold the chaos in place. This paradox of a boundless imagination tethered by invisible structure is what gives a painted composition its sense of clarity and intent. The grid isn't a constraint, it's the architecture that gives form to vision. Without it, ideas risk dissolving into noise. Images may exist, but they lack coherence, direction, and consequently, they lack weight. That is to say, structure doesn't limit expression, it refines it, it sharpens it. Caravaggio composed his scenes with dramatic emphasis on diagonals, knowing they didn't just organize space, but created energy. A diagonal draws the eye, slices through stillness, and forges dynamic relationships between figures and background. His genius lay in using the invisible geometry to animate the frame. Composition wasn't the stage for the drama, it was the drama. This marked a sharp break from the idealized balance of Renaissance art, embracing instead a raw, physical realism steeped in theatrical immediacy. He often places figures in compressed, shallow spaces, pushing them towards the picture plane so viewers felt not like observers, but witnesses. That spatial compression heightened emotional proximity. His use of chiaroscuro, that is, the bold interplay of light and shadow, was also a structural tool. Light became his major tool to carve out volumes, isolating expressions and directing the viewer's attention with near surgical intent. And you can truly see this Caravaggian visual language spill into contemporary photography, where the dramatic interplay of light and shadow supercharges intimate staging. Philip-Lorca diCorcia's work, particularly his Hads and Hustler series, echoes this style. His careful orchestration of light transforms ordinary scenes into stage-like tableaus. diCorcia frequently uses wide aperture and selective focus to draw attention to specific subjects, isolating them from their environment despite being embedded in it. Photographer Gregory Crewdson and archer Tress have distinctive styles, but utilize the same techniques. Their compositions are also elevated by meticulous staging. Crewdson's suburban dreamscapes feel cinematic and surreal, infused with eerie stillness, while Tress's work often veers into the surreal and symbolic, drawing from dreams, myths, and psychological archetypes. Yet, both photographers used classical compositional techniques. Leading lines and depth through layered spaces guide the viewer's eye and evoke narrative tension. Their work shows that composition is not just about arranging visual elements, but about designing a world. Staging becomes an extension of structure, allowing the photographer to fully control the atmosphere within the frame. And the structure doesn't have to be so obvious either. A subtle placement of figures just off center creates enough imbalance or emotional distance that the result is a hyper-real, dreamlike composition that blurs the lines between documentary truth and constructed fiction. Krzysztof Kieślowski's cinematic compositions are equally attuned to the emotional and metaphysical weight of a moment. His compositions often isolate characters in frames saturated with mood, utilizing visual space to express what characters cannot. Kieślowski frequently isolates figures within confined frames, positioning characters at windows and mirrors or behind glass, subtly suggesting layers of emotional opacity. These visual choices imbue his films with a quiet intensity. How a figure is held within a frame can shape entirely how we see a subject. subjects are often placed off-center or pushed to the edges of the frame, creating negative space that speaks as loudly as the figures itself. This spatial tension turns the frame into a container for thought, for interiority. The emotional resonance of his films begin with this spatial sensitivity. Great composition asserts that the shot, not the scene, is the true unit of visual storytelling. A well-composed image can carry meaning on its own, independent of context. In photography, this is of course expected. A single frame must stand alone, complete and self-contained. But in cinema, a shot is often just a fragment, a partial explanation, one piece of a larger visual puzzle. The early innovation in filmmaking was the realization that a story could be told through a sequence of carefully constructed shots, each meaningful in its own right, yet designed to flow seamlessly into the next. This required the invention of a visual grammar that allowed stories to unfold clearly without drawing attention to the techniques behind them. Over time, filmmakers learned how to compose, shoot, and cut without disrupting the audience's attention. What emerges was a new kind of storytelling, one built image by image, where each shot carried not just information, but intention. Great composition, much like great editing, is often said to be invisible. When done well, it guides the viewer's eyes so naturally that they don't even notice the craft behind it. It simply feels right. But the opposite is also true. Great composition, like great editing, can be deliberately visible. It can call attention to itself. These are two schools of thought, subtlety versus assertion, both equally valid, both powerful in different ways. So how do we choose which to follow? The answer lies in the intent of the project. If the goal is immersion, drawing the viewer seamlessly into a world or emotional state, then invisible composition may serve best. But if the goal is to provoke, to make the viewers conscious of the image as an image, then stylized or overt composition can be a tool of disruption and reflection. The decision comes down to tone, narrative purpose, and authorship. What is this image for? What emotional or intellectual response are you trying to elicit? Like any language, composition can whisper or shout. It is up to the storyteller to choose the volume. Take these Wes Anderson shots, in opposition to, say, Edward Young. This perfectly symmetrical frame, the artifice of the color palette, and the frontal camera angle. The shot invites you to observe, to appreciate design, to notice every tiny detail placed with intention. It often evokes a feeling of detachment wrapped in charm, but one highly curated and even ironic. You feel like you're looking into a carefully constructed world, where control is everything, and where the messiness of life has been flattened into aesthetic precision. That's why his dollhouse sensibility translates so seamless into stop-motion animation. The artifice isn't a limitation, it's the point. Now contrast that with a typical Edward Young shot. Young's compositions breathe. They feel lived in and fragile. The camera doesn't demand your attention, but quietly observes. The composition isn't highly controlled or ornamental. Instead, it emerges organically from the rhythms of real life. Characters are often positioned at the edges of the frame, or partially obscured, framed through windows, doorways, or reflections. His use of space creates emotional distance, but not detachment. It allows you to sit for a moment. The frames feel as life is, unresolved, subtle.
那一定是我们都知道的地方。伯伯，我不知道的事情太多了。
As an artist working with figurative painting, I'm always looking outside my own medium for insight. Grouping together artists who work in vastly different disciplines through a thematic or aesthetic thread helps me build an internal library, a mental map of references I can draw from during a painting or sketching session. Studying radically different styles sharpens my eye. It expands my visual vocabulary and gives me more tools to reach for in moments of creative decision-making. Composition is not fixed to one medium, it is a way of seeing. But of course, every medium has its quirks, its own constraints and freedoms. Take video games, for instance. When you think about composition in games, you're not just thinking about visual arrangement, you're thinking about interactivity. The player becomes the camera eye. Composition shifts from a passive frame to an active experience. In a game like Resident Evil, composition is inseparable from the player's perspective. The use of static camera is highly intentional. Each angle is carefully framed based on visibility, tension, and narrative control. In Resident Evil 4, composition is key to immersion and tension building. The over-the-shoulder camera is tethered tightly to the player, and enemy AI is designed to rarely approach directly, instead flanking or circling the player, exploiting blind spots created by the limited field of view. Aiming further intensifies this effect. As the frame tightens, vision narrows, and the threat of the unseen grows. Every shot becomes a gamble, not just mechanically, but spatially. This logic of pacing and sequencing is equally critical in comics. Mangaka Takehiko Inoue treats composition not only as the arrangement within a panel, but as a rhythm across pages, a visual tempo that conveys motion and psychological weight. His panels often breathe, with subtle compositional cues that slow time and deepen atmosphere. A pause between actions, a close-up. These moments aren't decorative, they are deliberate tools of pacing. And when action comes, the rhythm tightens, panels tilt, borders narrow, movement accelerates. Composition here isn't static, it's alive, pulsing with the inner state of the characters. Kentaro Miura does that really well in Berserk too. His compositions are operatic. Panels swell with scale and intricacy, but they never feel messy. He plays with contrasts not just through light and shadow, but through density, hyper-detailed chaos against moments of open negative space. The masters of Japanese manga operate on a whole other level of compositional language. This is because they understand the concept of notan. That is, they understood that composition is built on three structural elements: line or geometry, placement of color, and notan, each offering a distinct path to visual harmony. Line is the most fundamental. It governs proportion, direction, rhythm, and spacing, the silent skeleton beneath all design. Color is the emotional engine of design. Color relationships can shape mood, rhythm, and atmosphere. So what is notan, and why it matters? Notan, a Japanese term meaning dark light, expands this logic into tone. It is the interplay of dark and light masses. It's what makes a black and white photograph arresting or a charcoal sketch quietly powerful. Unlike chiaroscuro, which is rooted in representation, notan focuses on abstract balance. It reveals beauty in opposites, shadows against light, solids against void. The best practitioners of notan, like the Zen ink painters, use the simplicity to evoke mood and spirit without literal detail. But notan isn't only about harmony, but about contrast. Overwhelming intricacy set against sudden emptiness, light carved from shadow. This balance of extremes, paired with sequencing control, elevates great comics in every genre, building dread or catharsis by carefully modulating the intensity from panel to panel. And it doesn't have to be this hyper-aestheticized or even specific to the form of manga. Something as quiet as a Hammershøi interior has a strong notan, where light and shadow are not just formal concerns, but emotional ones. His paintings are muted, gray, constrained. Figures are often positioned with the backs turned, isolated within sparse rooms, framed by open doorways or windows. These architectural divisions create visual tension without overt drama. Fine art, by its nature, rests on fine relations, delicate judgments of proportion, rhythm, weight, and energy. The ability to compose with grace, whether through lines, notan, or color, comes only with exercise and appreciation. True education in art is not about imitation, but refinement of judgment. One of the simplest yet most effective compositional tools is distance. Moving in close so your subject fills the frame creates intensity. It eliminates distractions and forces the viewer to confront what matters. It can feel intimate, claustrophobic, or focused, depending on how it's used. On the other hand, moving away reveals more context. It allows room for relations between the subject and environment to emerge. Changing distance transforms how the subject is read. Always ask, what this frame needs, more intimacy or more space? Ingmar Bergman is a master of these visual relations. This use of spatial tension and tonal restraint mirrors the psychological interiority at the core of his subjects. Worlds of silence, contemplation, and emotional distance are rendered entirely through composition. But before we continue, I just wanted to let you know that I've been teaching the core principles of composition in my compositional workshop on Patreon. It's designed to be clear and practical, focusing on the key concepts that will help you elevate your compositional skills across any visual medium. By joining, you're not only investing in your passion, you're also helping support this channel. If you're interested, all the links are in the description below. Withheld composition refers to a visual approach where meaning is created not by what is fully revealed, but by what is intentionally left out. Rather than laying everything bare in the frame, by withholding information, the artist creates emotional ambiguity and narrative tension. In Haneke's work, withheld composition becomes a moral and psychological strategy. He refuses to direct the viewer's attention in conventional ways. There are no guiding close-ups and no comforting resolutions. Instead, the camera often remains static, distant, and dispassionate, turning the viewer into an implicated observer. Take his framing. Characters are frequently placed at the edge of the frame or obscured by architectural elements. In moments of violence or emotional climax, Haneke often refuses to show what most directors would. The result isn't a lack of impact, it's more impact. The off-screen becomes a compositional force. By withholding the expected, Haneke makes space for the viewers to feel discomfort. In Cachet, for example, the film opens with a long, unbroken static shot of a house, a frame so ordinary it almost dares you to overlook it. But this composition isn't passive, it's charged with menace. As time stretches, we begin to question what we're seeing and what we're missing. Haneke teaches that what is left out is as important as what is included. Withheld composition becomes a tool for critical engagement, not passive consumption. Bresson and Dreyer's compositional skills are also not about complexity, but about restraint. Both directors understood that the emotional core of an image could be strengthened by what was withheld. Bresson's framing is economical, almost ascetic, yet every cut and composition feels sculpted around human gesture. Dreyer used space and close-ups with such intensity that the frame itself seemed to tremble with feeling. In both cases, composition becomes a vessel for transcendence, form used to reveal the indescribable. This same sensitivity to the unspoken and the still runs deeply to the works of Andrew Wyeth. His paintings are quiet, sparse, and often cold, yet they carry a haunting emotional density. Andrew Wyeth's compositional technique is built on clarity. He had a remarkable ability to organize visual elements into deceptively simple arrangements that carry profound psychological weight. His compositions often hinge on strong dominant shapes that anchor the scene with quiet authority. These shapes create a subtle visual architecture, allowing the eye to move fluidly while keeping the emotional tone intact. His framing choices often feel cinematic. Subjects are pushed to the edge, cropped or turned away, inviting the viewer to complete the emotional equation. He utilizes negative spaces, the area in an image that surrounds the main subject, the parts of the composition that are left unoccupied. But rather than being empty or meaningless, negative space plays an essential role in shaping how we see and feel the subject itself. It gives the subject room to exist. When used deliberately, negative space can create a sense of calm, isolation, or even tension, depending on its relationship to the figure or object it frames. It draws attention not by competing with the subject, but by emphasizing the subject itself. Masters of spatial tension like Terrence Malick use negative space with intention, often surrounding a central object or figure with large expanses of emptiness and landscape to grant the image visual structure. It creates a sense of distance that shapes how the subject is perceived. He composes much with absence as with form. Andrei Tarkovsky carries that further. His use of composition becomes time-bound and elemental. He lingers. He lets images break down and reform. His images become liminal spaces where the material world brushes against something spiritual. Time in Tarkovsky's work doesn't simply pass, it thickens. His use of duration and spatial depth create a sense of contemplation rather than momentum. The camera lingers not to observe action, but to allow the viewers to inhabit space, a space that often carries memory or grace. Even in his Polaroid photographs, Tarkovsky's instinct for this kind of visual poetry remains intact. Despite the immediacy of the medium, the same compositional intelligence is present, diffuse natural light, restrained color, and the quiet geometry of figures in space. Many of these images are taken in rural settings or modest interiors, but they feel elevated, charged with atmosphere and subtle metaphysical weight. This is the artifice of composition, a style in which the construction of the image is deliberately made visible. Rather than hiding the mechanics of framing, light, or spatial design, this approach emphasizes them. Lines, space, and relationships within the frame are arranged with intention, often stylized or symbolic. The viewer is not meant to forget they are looking at a constructed image. Instead, they are invited to engage with how it has been constructed. One of the most effective ways to do this is by manipulating spatial relationships. You can imply a connection between objects that may not exist in real life simply by how you compose them. While placing a subject in the foreground and letting the background sit passively behind is common, this can divide the composition into disconnected zones. A more compelling approach is to allow the foreground and background to interact, to merge visually into a unified spatial logic. This doesn't just add aesthetic appeal, it generates depth, drawing the viewer into a three-dimensional world on a two-dimensional surface. Even though a photograph or frame contains only one plane, it can depict three: foreground, middle ground, and background, all dynamically linked to create a more immersive and harmonious image. In Murnau's oeuvre, composition is heightened through theatrical expressionism. Architecture leans unnaturally, shadows stretch and distort. The world bends under the weight of story, and the frame becomes a stage for metaphors. Murnau's visual strategy draws heavily from painters like Caravaggio and Rubens. He often isolates figures in pools of light that function as emotional spotlights and uses dramatic diagonals to create swirling energy. He never forgets its roots in still image making each frame a carefully constructed tableau that fuses cinema with the visual language of Baroque painting. Murnau's division of foreground, middle ground, and background is not merely a spatial convention, it's a dramatic tool. He uses depth not just to situate characters within the world, but to orchestrate emotional hierarchies. The foreground often holds symbolic or expressive weight, asserting a psychological presence before the narrative even unfolds. Murnau's mastery lies in how he weaves these planes together in the frame so that each layer contributes to the overall rhythm and mood of the image. The image does not simply contain a story, it becomes an active participant in how that story is felt. Sergei Parajanov, on the other hand, constructs his compositions like icon paintings. Flattened and ornamental, his figures are staged frontally. every object in the frame has a symbolic meaning. There's little illusion of naturalism. Instead, the viewer is presented with a series of visual tableaus, all-encompassing compositions that communicate through mythic resonance. Parajanov doesn't hide the artifice, he celebrates it. His compositional strategy hinges on formal symmetry, repetition, and spatial flattening. He often divides the frame into bands, horizontal strips, each containing its own symbolic action, like panels in a religious triptych. His frames are highly choreographed, yet they rarely feel kinetic. Rather than guiding the eye through depth, Parajanov arranges his elements to concentrate meaning at the surface, drawing inspiration not from realism, but from folk traditions and religious iconography. Artists can use flatness or depth as active compositional tools, depending on the emotional or narrative effect they seek. Flatness emphasizes surface, shape, and graphic clarity. It draws attention to the frame as a design, not a window. Depth, on the other hand, introduces spatial relationships that mimic how we see the world, offering a sense of immersion or realism. What matters is not choosing one over the other, but using each deliberately. Dynamic symmetry is a compositional approach that uses natural proportions to create images that feel balanced, harmonious, and alive. Unlike formal symmetry, which relies on equal mirroring, dynamic symmetry allows for asymmetry with structure. It offers a system of intersecting lines and proportional spacing that guides the placement of elements within the frame. This results in compositions that are not only aesthetically pleasing, but also deeply functional, leading the viewer's eye through the image in a way that feels organic rather than forced, even when the image is heavily composed. Yasujirō Ozu, though often described as a minimalist, exemplifies dynamic symmetry through his deeply structured visual style. His low camera angles, architectural framing, and restrained blocking aren't random, they follow an intentional order based on spatial balance. These choices are never decorative. They reflect a compositional discipline where every object and figure holds visual weight in relation to the whole. Ozu's use of space teaches us that dynamic symmetry isn't always about making things look mathematical, it's about creating visual harmony through intentional placement. His compositions breathe with balance and tension all at once, demonstrating how thoughtful structure can elevate the most mundane moments. For anyone learning visual storytelling, dynamic symmetry offers a method to compose with elegance and purpose, leading the viewer not just to see, but to feel the design behind the image. It offers the possibility of the frame as a complete aesthetic object, consciously playing with the logic of film and the artifice of cinema. It's here that composition begins to move beyond classical order and into the realm of aesthetic totality, where the frame is no longer just a container for narrative, but a site of visual experimentation and sensory impact. Powell and Pressburger's opera films, Stan Brackett's film manipulation, the short films of David Lynch, films like Begotten. These works don't just use the frame, they are the frame. Every element within the borders reject representation in favor of a total aesthetic experience. Recently, in our Deep Dive Film Club, we screened Tetsuo the Iron Man by Shinya Tsukamoto. It was an unforgettable experience to watch it with everyone on Discord and witness everyone's reactions. Tsukamoto's approach to composition is fascinating in that he denies the existence of a fixed compositional philosophy altogether. His work is frenetic, raw, and intensely physical. It's not about framing in the traditional sense, but about detonating the frame from within. He treats the cinematic frame the way a graphic designer approaches a poster. The image is constantly in flux, cutting, colliding, stuttering, pushing past narrative into something more primal. In Tetsuo, the frame becomes a living thing, an extension of the film's themes of transformation, metal, and flash. It's cinema as punk graphic design, as brutal kinetic sculpture. It reminds us that sometimes the most radical thing a filmmaker can do is to completely reinvent what the frame is for. Shūji Terayama also approaches composition not merely as a visual organization, but as an aesthetic statement. He often fractured traditional compositions altogether. His work uses a collage of theatrical artifice, layered images, deep spatial depth alongside flatness, and shifting spatial logic to compose through contradiction. His visual strategy is intentionally dissonant, breaking visual continuity to reveal the constructed nature of identity and perception. His frames are seldom about harmony, they are about interruption, disruption, and doubling, forcing the viewer to question the coherence of the image itself. Composition and fragmentation are not opposites, they are interdependent. To fragment a composition effectively, there must first be a sense of structure to break free from. Fragmentation becomes a compositional logic of its own. Spatial continuity is disrupted, focal points dissolve, and the viewer is pulled into a field of visual contradiction. This kind of composition does not seek to guide the eye in a graceful arc. Instead, it's an active experience, one that invites you not to rest in the image, but to interrogate it. This compositional logic of fragmentation finds echoes in the work of Daido Moriyama, who uses the camera to reject traditional notions of compositional polish and technical perfection. His photographs are often grainy, high contrast, and aggressively cropped, images that feel torn from the raw, unfiltered chaos of the street. Moriyama embraces motion blur, off-kilter framing, and obscure subjects as intentional gestures, not mistakes. He composes with urgency rather than precision. The result is a photographic language built on instability. Satoshi Kon carries this fragmentation into the cinematic realm with dazzling complexity. His compositions frequently fracture linear time and space, blending dreams and hallucinations within a single visual plane. Kon composes sequences where the viewer is unsure whether they are in one location or another. The spatial coherence collapses by design, but of course he organizes all that by using grids. Beneath the visual disruption lies an underlying compositional rigor. Scenes may fracture narratively, but they bound visually through the careful placing of visual information. Those are filmmakers and artists who question the very foundations of composition. They do not think how do we compose for clarity, but why we should even do so in the first place. To them, clarity in composition can feel like a form of control, a way of closing down ambiguity, directing attention too rigidly, or flattening the complexity of perception. For these creators, clarity is not always a virtue. Is a structure to be dismantled or deliberately withheld. Their question is not just what do you see, but what does seeing cost you? What are you missing out on? And yet the tension between clarity and disruption is not a binary. Rejecting clarity can be a form of resistance. Embracing it can be an act of trust. Each approach carries its own ethics, its own aesthetics, and both are powerful, depending on what the work demands. To compose for clarity is to believe that the frame can guide attention with intention, that it can help the viewer see what matters, understand spatial or emotional relationships, and feel grounded within the image. Clarity doesn't mean simplicity or sterility. It means that the visual logic is readable. In this way, clarity is a kind of generosity. It invites the viewer in, offering visual structure as a foundation for deeper interpretation. Composing for clarity is especially powerful when the subject matter itself is ambiguous. The clearer the form, the more space there is for nuance within it. A clean frame doesn't limit meaning, it creates the condition for meaning to unfold. This is why many great filmmakers, designers, and photographers compose with a clear visual hierarchy. They understand that how something is shown shapes how it is felt. During the Disney Renaissance, composition was central to how story and emotion were delivered. Every frame was designed to guide the viewer's gaze with total intentionality. Character silhouettes were clear and expressive, environments layered with foreground, midground, and background to create depth and visual beats timed precisely. This elevated the animations done in this period by making them overtly designed. Every frame carried the mark of intention, even in moments of spectacle. There was always visual storytelling clarity. The frame wasn't just beautiful, it was beautiful and functional. You see this in Hayao Miyazaki too. He uses line, scale, and atmosphere to make the fantastic feel intimately real. Miyazaki understands how to compose stillness. His frames often hold space for the in-betweens, for visual narrative pauses that gives his world depth. Mamoru Oshii also builds from symmetry, scale, and isolation. Characters are often dwarfed by their environments, framed within cold geometries. Space becomes existential, and his deliberate compositional choices invites contemplation. Great master artists understand that composition from imagination is not indulgence, it is discipline. The most fantastical, surreal, or symbolic imagery still depends on what is shown and what is revealed. The frame is still the biggest decision. So again, I want to close this by bringing it back to the beginning. When we talk about the rules of composition, we are really talking about what's considered right. But the truth is, great artists in every medium will make the rules their own. That doesn't always mean bending the rules, but appropriating them, absorbing them so fully that they no longer feel like rules at all, but instinct and style. They internalize structure not to follow it blindly, but to wield it deliberately. It's about using composition as a personal language, making it your own. And you can only do that by knowing all its nooks and crannies, by spending time with it until its logic becomes second nature. That familiarity gives you fluency, and fluency is what gives you ultimate freedom. Composition isn't just a set of techniques, it's a way of thinking visually. Because the more you study great composition across disciplines, the more you start to realize that perfection isn't always the goal. Rules, when used with intention, become a kind of visual subtext, a language beneath the surface of the image, imbuing it with meaning. So ask yourself, what's wrong with this picture? And this one? And this one? Maybe everything, maybe nothing. Maybe what you're seeing is a crack in the surface where meaning starts to leak through. Artists use these mistakes to reveal tension, vulnerability, human truths that perfect design alone can't always reach. So the next time you see a carefully composed image, don't just admire it, question it. The rule you thought was broken might be the very thing holding the image together. Is the reason the image stays with you? Is the contradiction that gives it weight? Is the visual decision that transforms a picture into something you'll never forget?